of a challenge for doing the hybrid, so bear with us in that.
Right now.
But I want to say that I teach a course. I teach in the morning. Some of the students are here, and David was the guest speaker this morning in the class. And so we try to, again, promote the inclusion and sustainable relationships through everything we do here, including teaching our class. And I just want to mention very briefly some upcoming events. Right here in this room, 350 North Campbell, for those of you who are on Zoom, we have our chocolate fest with lots of chocolate. It's always near Valentine's Day. This time it's the day before. And we announce our photo contest winners. And then we're having a special program where call it Turning the Tables. Zach Ziegler and Chris Conover from our local NPR station, The Buzz and Water Tapped podcast will be here, and I'll be asking them some questions instead of the other way around. So please join us. That's at 4 o'clock. March 4th, we have another book talk. This will be all Zoom by Dr. Peter Glick talking about his recent book. And then already on the schedule is a webinar. More information will come out where we're going to have Scottsdale, Phoenix, and Tucson talk about their advanced water purification plans here for their cities and service areas. So one other thing, we have our conference, May 2021, topic there being shared borders and shared waters. We're going to be looking at waters and borders shared with Mexico, with Native nations, and upper basin, lower basin, rural, urban, any kind of border. So we'd encourage you to subscribe to our weekly waves so that you can be informed of when we'll open registration and the like. So with all that, I will now with pleasure introduce our speaker, Dr. David DeJong, who's going to talk about his most recent book, Damming the Gila River Indian Community and the San Carlos Irrigation Project, 1900 to 1942. David DeJong grew up in Mesa, Arizona, earning an MA and PhD in American Indian Law and Policy from the University of Arizona. He joined the Pima-Maricopa Irrigation Project of the Gila River Indian Community in 2001, and in 2006 became the director, overseeing all planning, design, and construction of Gila River Indian Community's irrigation system under the Arizona Water Rights Settlement Act and Master Repayment Contract. When completed, the project will irrigate 90,000 acres and includes a holistic approach to water management, including managed aquifer recharge and solar over canal. And I don't know, David, if you're going to bring any of the current in there, but the current's quite exciting as to what David's involved in. His academic work focuses on Indian water rights and agricultural history. He has published 10 books, 4 of which focus on the Gila River Indian Community. And where he finds time to write all these books, I don't know, but we're glad that you do. And so, David, I'll turn over the podium to you. He's going to speak maybe 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for Q&A discussion. So thank you, David.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you for joining. And I'm opening that water because I'm still recovering from last week, and I hope my voice will hold out. I am David DeJong, and I do see some familiar faces in here. It's been a while since I've seen some of you, but I do see some familiar faces. And I am director of the Pima-Maricopa Irrigation Project. I've worked for the Gila River Indian Community since 1992, other than a 3-year break in the mid-90s when I went to the Oneida Indian Nation in New York State, and then got smart and came back to the sunshine. But today I want to talk with you about the third in what will be a 5-volume series on the history of the Gila River Indian Community and water rights. This one calling Damming the Gila River Indian Community. Okay. There we go. My first book, which actually was my dissertation as well here at the U of A back almost 20 years ago now, was Stealing the Gila. And it tells the story of how the river and the water of the river were stolen from the community and the effect it had in the mid to later 19th century. Then moved into diverting the Gila which was the first attempt to restore water to the community under the Florence-Casa Grande project. It was a huge failure, did not succeed. Most recent is damming the Gila, and this looks at the San Carlos Irrigation Project. I'll talk a little bit about the Gila Decree as well. And I'm currently working on fighting for the Gila, which I hope to finish this summer. And then when I'm retired in about 4 years, it will be restoring the Gila. And I'd love to talk about that one now because what the community is doing is incredible. As Sharon alluded to, with managed aquifer recharge, restoring portions of the river, first ever in the Western Hemisphere solar over canal project, and then just some of the most innovative water management I think you will find not only in the state of Arizona, but perhaps in the West. All right, I'm going to start with looking at Carl Hayden. I think we all know Carl Hayden. Carl Hayden was immensely popular in the mid-1920s. In fact, you can see how popular he was in Pinal County. Why am I focused on Pinal County? Because that's where the San Carlos Irrigation Project is. Carl Hayden will have his hand directly involved in the San Carlos Irrigation Project, the legislation, what it looks like, how it was shaped, and he will also have his hand in the Gila Decree, which will be issued in 1935. Just for context, the Akimel O'otham, by the time the 1924 San Carlos, am I in your way?
No.
By the time the San Carlos Irrigation Project was authorized, the Akimel O'otham had abandoned, when I say scores of farms, really it's hundreds of farms. Thousands of acres had gone out of production because of the loss of water. Again, if you read Stealing the Gila, and I'm not necessarily trying here to promote the sale of all these books, because I realize they're expensive. The U of A, unfortunately, is a little bit on the expensive side, but nonetheless, with the loss of water was the loss of farmland. Loss of farmland meaning that the culture was impacted, the people were impacted, the economy was impacted. It had tremendous ramifications throughout the community. And I'm not going to read some of the quotes below, but I want you just to look at those as I'm talking, because they're kind of trying to give you a little perspective of some of the people who wrote but were alive at the time these events were occurring. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about building momentum for SCIP, or the San Carlos Irrigation Project. All right, by 1923, the prospects for a San Carlos bill in Congress were very good. In April of 1924, Arizona Senators Henry Ashurst and Ralph Cameron unanimously got the Senate to approve of the San Carlos bill. Pretty miraculous when you think about it, unanimous approval of a piece of legislation. In June, the House approved it unanimously, but the bills differed. So the bill had to be reconciled. Carl Hayden took advantage of that. And when he rewrote the bill that would be approved, Carl Hayden introduced several components that reflected, number one, the social reform of Elwood Mead. And if you're thinking Lake Mead, you're on the right track. Elwood Mead was an engineer, worked for the University of California. He was also part of a water commission in the early 1920s. He was part of the group that oversaw the renaming of the National of the Reclamation Service to the Bureau of Reclamation. Well, Elwood Mead loved this idea of the yeoman farm. And so he influenced Carl Hayden. Carl Hayden rewrote the bill to limit growers to 160 acres, which was not well received among the non-tribal growers in the Florence-Casa Grande Valley. And the House of Representatives demanded repayment. And that was unfortunate because this was the first reclamation bill that actually demanded repayment. And as a result, Carl Hayden used this opportunity to open the San Carlos project, which should have been for the Gila River Indian Community only. And now it became a joint use project where the project was shared roughly 50-50 with tribal and non-tribal growers. But by 1923, the prospects were very, very favorable. So what did the Hayden bill look like? Well, we already talked about the 160-acre maximum farm size. What Hayden recognized with the repayment obligation, he knew the Akimel O'otham would never be in a position to repay their portion, nor did the Akimel O'otham feel they had any obligation to repay it, by the way. But Carl Hayden recognized that since the House wanted repayment, he needed to find a way to get repaid or have the federal government repaid for this expenditure. And so he pushed this idea of a joint works project that we're going to use the Gila River Indian Community and its need for water to restore water, not only to the community, but also provide water for what is today the San Carlos Irrigation Drainage District, 50,000 acres of land off reservation. This was part of a distributive policy that made it much more palatable to split the water than to reallocate it. And in the 1920s, the likelihood of reallocating water to recognize or acknowledge the rights that the Akimel O'otham or the Gila River Indian Community, i.e. community, had was not likely going to happen. We also need to recognize at the time that Indian country was considered a quote unquote last frontier of America. And so there was, in the early 20th century, there was a lot of activity focused in Indian country, in particular where there were lands that could be irrigated. Historian Donald Pisani writes that irrigation policy in the latter 19th and early 20th century here changed from this quote unquote civilization to becoming the greatest enemy of Native people, simply because the National Reclamation Act unleashed a movement of putting the last remaining water resources to use. And tribes had a really hard time competing with non-tribal members because they weren't citizens, they did not vote, they did not have the financial resources. And Carl Hayden knew that. Carl Hayden was beholden to his elected constituents. The Akimel O'otham were not among his constituents. So the bill really represents something that's not a favorable bill for the community. Context for the distributive policy. Certainly we need to recognize in the post-Civil War years, there was this concept of conquest by kindness coming out of the Civil War. President Grant signed Indian agencies to various church groups. And rather than having military people, church groups, and the idea was conquest by kindness. It also is influenced by the Freedmen's Bureau in the post-Civil War years, the whole concept of 40 acres and a mule, which by the way, never happened. But nonetheless, it helped influence this policy. And this is not an official policy. This is just a theoretical framework that I'm working on. Actual Daniel McCool at the University of Utah actually came up with this concept. But agriculture was at the center, land severalty or allotment of land, civilizing effects of ownership. That was the whole theory behind land allotment, and creating yeoman farmers. The fact that they might not be economically feasible, especially on Gila River when land was allotted in 10-acre parcels, seemingly didn't matter. All right, so a once prosperous people, that is the Akimel O'otham and Peeposh, now fell before this national experiment of yeoman farmers. Not that this concept is new. I think we all recognize the concept of yeoman farming. It goes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson. In the West, as I've kind of already alluded to, water meant stiff competition. And here in the not here, but in the Florence-Casa Grande Valley, most of the land was settled under the Desert Land Act. And under the Desert Land Act, in order to perfect the title, you had to prove up the land, which meant you had to put water on it, create stiff competition. And when you have politicians that are supporting non-tribal growers over tribal growers, not saying it was easy, but it was certainly easier. All right, these are just the Florence-Casa Grande canals. Here is the Gila River Indian Community. So you can see all of it, and the Gila River flows in a westerly direction here. This is McClellan Wash, which once was a largely perennial stream that was intercepted by Picancho Reservoir, no longer flows. But all these canals headed above the community, meaning they took water out of the river first. And then certainly up in the eastern part of our state, in the upper valleys, there were all of these irrigation canals that took water in the Safford Valley and also further upstream in the Duncan-Verdon valleys. Point being, the river was diverted. By the time it hit the community, very little, if any, water remained. And such was the state of the community in June of 1900. That's the headline of the Chicago Tribune's. Again, just a little bit of context, and I'm going to go through this quickly because we only have another 30 minutes. Land loss and leasing. Just recognize in the 1890s, the United States was emphasizing development of resources and putting all of the land and resources into use. And if somebody's not using it, i.e. Native peoples aren't using the land according to the idea of what non-tribal people would look at development, then somebody else is going to come in. Well, in the 1890s, 12 million acres of tribal land was open to non-Indian settlement. That did not happen on Gila River, although it nearly did. By 1895, 3.3 million acres of tribal land is now leased to non-tribal members. And keep in mind, when I talk about tribal members, oftentimes in a majority of the cases did not have the fiscal resources to develop the land. Hence, BIA or the Indian Service just simply leased it and allowed non-tribal growers to come in. Again, reservations open to homesteading. And so the setting at Gila River in 1904, the Presbyterian Church, which was assigned to Gila River as Indian agents back in the 1870s, they visited the community. They faced, they interviewed 300 tribal members, all of whom were facing hardships. And they all informed President Theodore Roosevelt, we need a storage reservoir. Not that the concept was new, but this gave renewed interest that there needs to be a project on the Gila River. Two non-tribal missionaries, Charles Cook and Dirk Lay, you can see the length of time. They were both Presbyterians, worked among the community, and their influence was tremendous. Almost over a half a century of influence. And they influenced a number of people who became very prominent leaders, including Roe Blaine Lewis, the father of Rodney Lewis, father of present-day Governor Stephen Roe Lewis. Well, of that study, the Presbyterian Church identified 74% of the farmers, of the families, grew absolutely no crop at the turn of the 20th century. Again, these are hard times. This is all discussed really in Stealing the Gila. Casa Grande Valley, well, here is the valley that was intended to be developed in the Florence Casa Grande Valley. Here was the competitor to the north, the Salt River Valley, or AKA the Salt River Project, as it would later become known. And everything the Florence Casa Grande Valley attempted to do, Salt River Valley did so much better, unfortunately. Salt River Valley was organized, Casa Grande Valley was not. And you can see the number of acres that were served. Point of all of this is these acres are taking water that otherwise would come down the river and no longer were flowing. So they deprived the river. And you can see in 1904, there can be no more development because the water is already over appropriated. 1859, the community was farming 15,000 acres. By 1900, 3,600 acres. Tremendous impact as a result. Series of irrigation projects were approved in the early 1900s. I'm going to go through them quickly. All of these projects still exist. This one happens to be buried in silt. This one happens to be obliterated. Agency project no longer functions. Casablanca project, the largest of which of the five, still very much in existence. And the Blackwater project, which also exists, although this flume no longer stands. And then in Saccadone Flats. The point of all of this is there was an attempt to put water to use, but when there was no water in the river, it's really hard to put water to use. So, hope for San Carlos Irrigation Project. In 1912, Congressman John Stevens of Texas introduced a bill that would have done two things. Number one, it would authorize the San Carlos project, and number two, it would authorize adjudication of water rights on the Gila River Indian Community. Carl Hayden opposed it, and he killed it. And he killed it because he wanted a joint works project, a project that would benefit non-tribal growers in addition to the tribal growers. Carl Hayden defined the problem of Akimel O'otham as deprivation as environmental. Now, I'm not saying there were not environmental changes that occurred around the turn of the 20th century and in the early decades of the 20th century, because there certainly were. But it was not all environmental. It was upstream diversions. But what the Akimel O'otham did do, that Carl Hayden used very well, is they were a strong moral voice to convince Congress to appropriate funds for a project. Well, in 1914, there was an adjudication survey. It was really a farce. It had no real impact on a larger project. This did authorize the Florence-Casa Grande project, which is discussed in diverting the Gila. But Carl Hayden here saw an opportunity. Carl Hayden saw here an opportunity that I don't want this to go into the federal courts. So he encouraged 2 non-tribal growers to initiate a friendly lawsuit. Went into the Pinal County Court in Florence. Pimas were not there, or the Akimel O'otham were not there. The federal government was not there as their trustee. The local court issued a decree, and it will be successful in encouraging Congress to authorize the Florence-Casa Grande project. I'm going to pass through all of this. This is the Florence-Casa Grande project. It authorized this dam and the intake gates there on the far right side of the screen. We are going to completely rebuild this coming dry up, the fall of 2025. Whole new dam will be going across the river. But this is the project that was needed, the San Carlos Irrigation Project. The Florence-Casa Grande project was the first step. Carl Hayden's hope was if he could get Congress to appropriate a little money each year, that before Congress realized that they would have multi-millions of dollars already invested. And at that point, Carl Hayden thought they can't say no to the big project, the San Carlos project and Coolidge Dam. And to that degree, he was correct. Well, identifying the San Carlos site, a lot of people ask, well, San Carlos Irrigation Project must serve the San Carlos Apache tribe. It does not, but it just happened to be that the San Carlos site was at the confluence of the San Carlos River and the Gila on the very western edge of the San Carlos Apache Reservation. It was identified in 1899, you can see the hydrologist there. And in 1899, the first bill was introduced by Arizona's territorial delegate to appropriate funds. Nothing happened for the next dozen years or so. Not a whole lot happened in terms of moving forward on the San Carlos project because the National Reclamation Act had been approved, and there was a lot of wrangling over who was going to be funded and who wouldn't, and that would ultimately lead to the San Carlos project, the Salt River project. Well, after Carl Hayden killed the project, Carl Hayden introduces his own bill to authorize the project and the dam, but as a joint works. Again, I want to be clear, joint works meaning tribal and non-tribal. Hayden promised all of the growers in the upper valleys of eastern Arizona, your water rights will be protected. We're not going to influence them. We will not interfere with them. He united Florence and Casa Grande. Now, that may sound like a simple thing, but the reality is Florence and Casa Grande in the early 20th century were on the verge of civil disobedience because they disagreed with each other over the project. Carl Hayden united them. He got the Army Corps of Engineers to issue a report in 1914. There you can see the results. A dam is feasible. Well, the Committee on Special Advisors, this is the one I mentioned earlier about Elwood Mead. He was one of 6 members, chaired by former Territorial Governor Thomas Campbell of Arizona. I've already addressed this. This is what Carl Hayden adopted from this commission. And that's what he put into the San Carlos bill. Well, then fortuitously, I guess, President Harding died and Calvin Coolidge ascended to the presidency. Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge were tight with money. This did not lead to good prospects. Now, the Tucson newspapers here, the Tucson Citizen, in fact, had an editorial right about this time, and they told Carl Hayden, when you go back to DC to get this bill approved, you better be armed with a 6-shooter and a rifle, because that's what it's going to take to get this bill through Congress. You're going to face a lot of resistance. It's not going to happen. Well, Dirk Lay, the Presbyterian missionary, was very instrumental. He united 5,000 Presbyterian churches across the country who inundated Congress with memorials and telegrams and remonstrances. And then in December 1923, he went to DC to feel out the climate to see if there might be hope for the passage of this bill. And in December, he introduced Senate Bill 966. It was introduced by Ralph Cameron, and it was introduced as an Indian bill, not as a reclamation bill. That means it went into the Committee on Indian Affairs. And there's the purpose. That was the purpose of the bill, to repay a debt. We don't want to lose sight of that. Every time I speak in the community, both with the Florence Casa Grande project and the San Carlos project, I point out the actual legislation and said, you need to remember both projects were authorized for your benefit. Not how it turned out, but that's what they were authorized. All right, calling on President Coolidge. This is almost a remarkable thing. On June 6th, Congress was set to adjourn. On May 1st, the House Committee of Indian Affairs approved of the bill. There you see the Presbyterians flooding Congress with telegrams asking the Speaker of the House to put the bill on the calendar. It was not on the calendar, meaning it had no business being approved that session. And they asked Calvin Coolidge to support the bill. On June 2, they needed Calvin Coolidge to go meet with Speaker Gillette and say, Speaker Gillette, okay, we're 4 days from adjournment. You need to get this bill on the calendar, and we need to approve of it this session. June 4, the House approved of it. June 7, because Henry Ashurst and Ralph Cameron and Carl Hayden were concerned Calvin Coolidge would veto the bill, they met with the president and said, by the way, the dam will be called Coolidge Dam. The next day, President Coolidge signed the bill into law. So here is Coolidge Dam, right after it was completed in 1929. It was actually completed in 1928. It was first and foremost for the Akimel O'otham to store water. That was, quote unquote, then going to waste. Design, you can see that. Again, the world's first multiple dome dam. There's the contractor. Look at the cost. $3.4 million total. I mean, you can't turn a spade a shovel of dirt today for less than $1 million. Time frame, I'm going to just pass through this. I put this chart together to kind of help people understand how the dam was constructed. Again, there's the dam as it was being constructed. River was bypassed to the north side here. And then once the dam was constructed, they closed the in channel. And in November of 1928, water started to impound behind the reservoir. It was dedicated in March 1930. Calvin Coolidge did attend, although he didn't want to. He only attended because President Hoover said, you need to go and attend because it's named after you. The man who sold the show was Hollywood Mayor Will Rogers. And Will Rogers said, the Pimas were, Akimel O'otham were there. Will Patton, or Hugh Patton, that is, and an Apache chief from San Carlos were present. And Will Rogers told them, look at the water today because you're not going to see a drop of it in the future. And in many respects, he was correct. There were over 10,000 people that showed up. Final analysis of the dam. Charles Oberg, who was the designer and oversaw part of the construction, he believed the Akimel O'otham should not pay any of the cost of the dam because of the theft of their water in the 19th century. Yet, when the dam was completed in 1932, 4 years after, both districts, the community and SCID, had rights to 50,000 acres. And you can see SCID was at about 80%. The community was about maybe a little less than a third. Now, the second part of this equation is the Gila Decree. The Gila Decree was a court decision that was not favorable to the community. It was rejected by the community. It was never accepted by the community, and the community has resisted it ever since, literally from day one. It's filed in 1925, 1935. the decision, the consent decree was issued right here in Tucson, the federal district court. And it was strongly opposed by the community. And I'm not going to go into those that were in the earlier presentation. We'll have some inkling. I'm not going to go into all of the details of the decree, but let me just say that the decree allowed the upper valleys to keep all their water. And in the lower valley, in the San Carlos Irrigation Project, non-tribal growers got half of the water that came down the river. So the community, even though it had rights to 50,000 acres of land, has never irrigated more than 37,000. Today, we have only 17,000 in production. Precursor to the decree, well, the Justice Department attorney was a man named John Truesdale, who was very involved here in Arizona all the way back into the 19-teens. In fact, that adjudication survey that I alluded to earlier, John Truesdale was involved in that. He was largely beholden to the non-tribal growers, and he believed the Akimel O'otham claims under the Winters Doctrine, reserved rights doctrine, were weak. If you know anything about the Winters Decree, came out of Fort Belknap, a treaty tribe. And in the early cases, in the early 20th century, the cases that followed the Winters Decree, if it was a treaty tribe, the court generally upheld reserved rights. If it was a non-treaty tribe, the court did not. So the assumption was, if you have, if your reservation is established by act of Congress or executive order, you don't have reserved rights. Gila River was established by act of Congress and then expanded by 7 executive orders. Truesdale said, I don't think we can ever establish a Winters right here. Prior appropriation is basically what he argued under what ultimately would be the decree. That meant you had to show use and increase. That was hard to do when upstream users were already using the water. Charles Southworth and for the Indian Service, and a man named Mr. Woolsey of the San Carlos Irrigation Project, they were the first to document that the upper valleys were diverting water in disregard of downstream. This is prior to the decree, by the way, that they were diverting water in disregard of downstream user rights, and that it was having a significant impact. And as a result of that study in 1923, the Indian Service convinced Commissioner of Indian Affairs Charles Burke, you need to do something, initiate litigation. Well, again, I'm going to pass through the Winters Doctrine. I think probably most of you are familiar with it. It established the idea of reserved rights. But what's important to recognize is actually this case filed 6 months prior to the case in the Winters Doctrine. Same court, same judge, same federal prosecutor, but that case included this concept of future rights that got rolled into the Winters decision. And the Winters case, of course, established the idea of reserved rights. Those rights are in perpetuity, meaning tribes have whatever water rights they need, not to be quantified because their rights are going to change tomorrow, next year, next decade, the 22nd century. Of course, that didn't sit well with Western water users because they were under prior appropriation, and was with reserved rights, you did not know how much water tribes might have retained. Well, post-Winters, all we need to recognize here is once Winters came out, there was a lot of anxiety among politicians, in particular in Montana. I'm not going to go through the details. This is a plug. You got to read Damning the Gila to read all of the detail here. But Montana was very hostile to tribal water rights and did everything they could to preclude the tribes in Montana from utilizing water or even having rights to the water. Now, while what they attempted in Montana failed, it showed that Congress was willing to skirt the intent of the federal courts by just simply enacting legislation. Series of cases. This one happened to be on San Carlos. The court distinguished between treaty and non-treaty tribes and said, San Carlos, you don't have a reserved right. Ruled against. This was the same judge that William Salthill that started the hearings on the Gila Decree. 1916, Wind River Shoshone, they were a treaty tribe. So reserved rights were upheld. even for allotments within the ceded lands that ended up off reservation, but those reserved rights were retained regardless. This was a victory for tribes. Uinta cases in Utah, 1923, series of decrees. There was a treaty establishing, a treaty recognizing a relationship between the Ute and the United States, but the reservation was established under executive order, and therefore the courts had a hard time figuring out whether reserved rights or prior appropriation rights would prevail. And reality is neither one did prevail. While the Uinta Ute ended up with some water, they did not get all of the water they intended. Again, this is all prior to the Gila Decree. Congress acts again. Montana, all of these cases come out. Montana seeks again. We're going to open all the reservations in Montana, declare them all open to homesteading. That'll solve the problem. And for tribal members, you're going to get 3 years' time to put your water to use. Now, keep in mind, tribes had very little financial resources to do this, and 3 years' time is nothing. You can't build anything. Did nothing to protect water. What resulted for Gila River was the Florence Casagrande project, which was a piecemeal project. After Congress acted, a couple more cases. Fort Hall, Shoshone-Bannock. Again, a treaty tribe, no loss of water. Reserved rights prevail. Pyramid Lake Paiute led to the Ore Ditch Decree. The result here is there are some reserved rights. It's not as extensive as the tribes would have liked, and they ended up losing a lot of water, but the rights they did retain were under reserved rights. U.S. versus Walker River. The U.S. argued reserved rights. Court said no, because there's no treaty. Again, this is just context here. Summary of the cases, well, there were 3 stipulated decrees, as was the Gila Decree. Court rejected reserved rights because of lack of treaty in a couple of tribes. John Truesdale was involved in most of these cases. And again, John Truesdale is the one who's heading up the Gila River negotiations on the decree. So the 10-year negotiations of the Gila Decree was again filed in 1925. It was decided in 1935. John Truesdale was assigned to it. He argued you have to include the non-tribal growers because they have reserved rights as well. Again, I'm not going to talk about that today. That's either here or there. You'll have to read Damning the Gila for it. I'm going to pass on this. Let me just say on this slide, the revolving door of attorney. There were 6 attorneys fired one after the other on the Gila Decree. And finally, in 1935, the Interior Department and the Justice Department wanted a decree and said, issue a decree. And they did, but it was a consent decree. It was a compromise. The Upper Valley, they wanted a reservoir. Instead, they got something called the Substituted Storage Plan, which was huge for them. Upper Valleys refused to recognize prior appropriation rights for Gila River, for the Akimel O'otham, knowing that if they did, they would have lost all of their water. Again, the decree is neither reserved rights nor is it prior appropriation. The Nevada Consolidated Mining Company in the eastern part of Arizona kept all of its water rights because it was in the middle of the Depression. No court was going to deprive them of water and then throw all those people out of work. All just political consideration. San Carlos Irrigation District, this is Florence Cooley's area, Casagrande area, they got 50% of the water. And the community where they started with 250,000 acre feet ended up with 210,000 acre feet. The Akimel O'otham objected. They said we should get our water first. Solicitor Nathan Margold agreed, but Secretary of Interior disagreed. SCIP objected. Upper Valleys objected. The community traveled down here to the courthouse in Tucson. Judge Sames refused to admit them. He issued the decree, which really was a decree of appeasement. Here's the Gila River Decree. It was based on faulty hydrology. Earlier, I couldn't remember the numbers, but here you have them. Pre-1925 versus post-1925. The community did end up with immemorial rights to the waters of the Gila, but it was a hollow victory because of the Substituted Storage Plan. If you want to know what that is, I'll talk about it afterwards. It allowed the Upper Valleys to take their water in disregard of the downstream priority rights. Here are the decreed lands. These are the lands within the community. There are About 3,000 acres here by Gila Crossing on the west end. They have the lowest priority. They haven't taken any water since the 1940s. All of the decreed lands within the community. This is the San Carlos Irrigation Project, Safford Valley, and Duncan Verdon Valley. San Carlos Irrigation Project, should it have been a community-only project? But there was too little water and too many acres. Well, unfortunately, that didn't happen. We're going to come back to that here in a moment. But as the dam was being constructed, subjugation of the community began. 50,000 acres of land was clear cut, over 2 million trees removed, untold number of cactus and other vegetation. Over half of the land of the 50,000 acres proved to be unirrigable. It was highly saline and ended up being abandoned. And 26,000 more acres was reclaimed. O&M assessments, the community always argued that they should not have to pay operation and maintenance expenses because they had the prior right to the river. And in fact, the actual San Carlos project bill that Carl Hayden wrote said only lands under lease, meaning non-Indians leasing land on the reservation, pay the O&M assessments. Tribal members do not. And despite the fact that the legislation said it wasn't exactly clear. The Indian Service charged the community O&M assessments all the way up until the 1970s when the community fund prevailed, and today they pay no assessments. Post San Carlos project, well, who really benefited? If you look here, upper valleys, the per acre value of their crops. Look at the San Carlos district. This is the tribal farm that was run by the U.S. Indian Service. Today it's called Gila River Farms. And then these are the O'otham growers. And you can see the disparity is tremendous over who really benefited from the project. Final analysis. Carl Hayden married a joint works project because he thought he could get this through Congress because he knew his voting constituents. Remember, he carried Pinal County 1,484 to 20. He knew they were going to support him in the election, and his first and foremost job was to make sure he won re-election. So he married the Akimel O'otham's moral and legal rights with non-tribal off-reservation lands and created a joint works project. Florence Casa Grande Valley had the political strength again when the bill was approved on June 7. It was 5 days after Indian Citizenship Act had been approved. So tribal members were not voting here in Arizona. In fact, many of them would not vote until after 1948. I think some of you are aware of what happened in 1948. It protected the upper valleys. They kept all of their water, which was a huge benefit. And in the period that I'm looking at here, you can see the effect, Upper Valley, Florence Casa Grande Valley, and the community. Even by 1945, the upper valleys and Florence are well north of 40,000. The community was at 28. And as I mentioned, they will hit 37,000 acres in the early 1940s. And then it goes down from there because of lack of water. All right, I'm going to end with a couple of slides. We just had the 20th anniversary of the Arizona Water Settlements Act. Settlement means statutory protection of water for the community, 653,500 acre feet of water. Give you perspective, that's about 5 million people that could move on to the reservation and subsist just fine. Funding to put the wet water to paper, or paper water to put to wet use. And the community has reestablished itself as a major water partner. Here's the water budget. Again, it's 9 discrete sources of water, an enormous supply of water. PMF has always been at the center of the Arizona water settlement because the community had to demonstrate use of the water. If you couldn't demonstrate use, it was really hard to make the argument that the community was entitled to any additional water. System improvements, this looks familiar for some of you, but this is what we inherited, the old BIA system. And that's what it looks like today. It's a completely new system. We've invested to date right at $900 million in the new system. And after a century, or a century after the San Carlos Irrigation Project promised to restore water. The future is looking a whole lot brighter for the community today. And there's so much more I'd love to share on that. But I think some of you are aware of what the community is doing. It has flexed its muscle, and when it flexes its muscle, like the old E.F. Hutton commercial, when E.F. Hutton speaks, people listen. People listen to the community. Thank you. I'll open it up to any questions.
Yeah, Mayor. Yes, you're the one following. If there are any questions online.
Yeah. So far we only have one real question from the chat for David, and it's from Robin Interpreter.
Well,
I'm wondering if she'd like to unmute at some point.
Well,
We might take some
okay,
questions
yeah,
from the
let's
room
take from
first.
the room first, and then we'll get Robin. So questions. Mom, don't be shy. If not, let's see if Robin wants to ask her question. So that is going. Oh, and there, Julia, you have one.
To be a project manager of millions and millions of dollars of projects and do research on all of this history. I mean, how do you square that?
Well, I'm going to address the latter part first. Sharon brought it up too. You know, some people, their outlet, they ride bike, they golf. Mine is, I love going to the archives, reading documents. I spend about an hour to 2 hours every night, probably 4 hours every Saturday, maybe 3 hours on Sunday. I'm either reading something or writing or meditating, because it is my passion, and there are a lot of reasons I can explain later. But being project manager, I am humbled that the community has entrusted overall project management to me, and it's not me, it's a team. I have 29 people that work, all highly skilled technical engineers, civil techs, surveyors, etc. And I unashamedly say what the community is doing with the irrigation project is second to none. We are, quite literally, we are the shining star of the Bureau of Reclamation. I think it's fair to say, and I know there are other tribes represented here today, I think it's fair to say that the community is probably the leader. We may not be irrigating as many acres as the Navajo Nation yet, but what the community is doing in terms of the irrigation project and managing the water, I didn't say anything because I didn't have time for it, but the Solar Over Canal projects that we're doing, we just broke ground on our second, next month, number 3, July, number 4. Managed aquifer recharge, restoring the aquifer, restoring agriculture across the community. It's a life fulfillment of a life dream for me. I was 16 years old, quite honestly, 16 years old when I first drove across the community, and coming from a farm background, I saw a lot of fallow land, and I said, something happened, I want to know, and I want to do something about it. So I'm humbled that I have been with the community for 30 years. Again, I had a 3-year break with Oneida, but I'm humbled that the community has entrusted me with overseeing this project. It is a huge responsibility. I make no bones about it. I'm also very proud of the fact that we have a great staff. And as I told the class earlier, we put 95 cents of every dollar into actual construction. I think I can say this with great assurance. I think we are the most efficiently run irrigation construction project in the country. And my theory on that is, when I started with Pima, I wasn't director. For the first 5 years, I was not director. We had 140 people on staff. 140. And when I became director, we had 22. And now we have 29. And my theory is, I'm going to be long gone. I want the money to go in the ground to provide improvements that the community will enjoy for decades to come. Don't fund somebody's salary because they're going to leave and leave nothing behind. And I think we've been very successful in doing that.
If I might follow up on the question, you said that you had a background as a farmer, right? In the Casa Grande area, if I'm not mistaken, your family background?
Actually, that was in Minnesota. I was born in Minnesota where my family farmed. I came to Mesa when I was 11.
So what was it like as you started this research to find this rather sordid history of, you know, deprivation and then be working there at the same time?
Well, it was difficult. I mean, I used to do a lot of presentations in the community. I don't much anymore as a director. But in my first few years, I went out to all the schools, and one particular day, I happened to be with a group of young elementary students, and I was talking about water deprivation. There was a little girl sitting here in second grade, and she said, "That pisses me off." That's when I thought, maybe I'm giving too much at this level. But it's important. I was supposed to have spoken with the elders, all of the elders last Friday. And I had to call them on Thursday and say, I am sick in bed. I had no voice. I'm starting to lose it now. And I was heartbroken. I said, no problem. We're going to have you come out. We'll figure it out in the next couple of months. And it is sweet. I don't want to suggest anything, but you know, it takes a long time. I will never, and I don't seek to be fully acknowledged and adopted by the community. That's not my point. But it takes a long time to gain trust of people. And when I first started in the community, I had a number of people that said some real unkind things. And if it hadn't been for the fact that I had gone through the American Indian Law and Policy studies here and had already done some work in Indian country, it might have been real easy to have left. But I stayed because I said, I understand the hurt. And I'm committed. My family is married into the Gila River Indian community, so it's not just objective, it's my family's there. I've got family members that live in the community, so it's become very personal. But like I said, I am humbled by the community. It is my objective to do nothing that will harm the community, and I have the support of the community for events like today. The books that I write, the community purchases them all. In fact, I typically give them all to the members of council. Lots of people want them, and I say, I'm sorry, I can't because they cost me $40, and we give out 17 bucks. It's no small amount. But it is a true, genuine pleasure to work for the community. And I'm not crying. I'm just still dealing with some residual issues from last week.
Robin, still there?
I think Robin's available. It will her.
It should go over the, if she's on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, cool. Well, David, your presentation was really great, and it's interesting because we were farm kids from the Midwest, and I came out here when I was 12 years old as well. My path, some of you probably don't know, I'm Robin Interpreter. I'm a tribal water rights attorney. And in my early years out of law school from U of A, I worked for Joe Sparks and represented the San Carlos Apache tribe. And I too love history. Like, my thing was dig in the history books, read the files, read the papers, read that legislative history and see all the different things that are going on. And I really appreciate David telling this story for Gila River Indian Community. The interesting thing about it that happens so many times in Indian country is that more than one tribe is wrapped up in a situation. And for this situation along the Gila River, the San Carlos Apache tribe was absolutely affected by the flooding of their reservation, by the installation of the SCIP project, which none of that water was to benefit them. It was to benefit the downstream tribe, Gila River Indian Community, as well as the SCID folks. And so there were just devastating impacts that were visited upon the San Carlos Apache tribe. They had successfully been farming thousands of acres underneath where the San Carlos Reservoir sits today, and they were flooded out. They lost their homes. The town of Old San Carlos is underneath that reservoir. There's archaeological problems. There's graves and burials underneath that reservoir. It's kind of like when you think about the Tennessee Valley Project and that flooding, it was kind of the same thing that happened to San Carlos Apache on a smaller scale. But they lost all their farmlands. And so I think, when we talk about history and we tell history, I feel like it's really important to look at all the different dynamics and all the different things that are going on. When I was getting my master's degree in American Indian Studies at U of A, I was trying to figure out, well, what was my master's thesis going to be? And Joe Sparks said to me, he said, Robin, can you think about why is Arizona so adverse to the Apaches? And he had been litigating in the Gila Decree case. That Globe Equity Gila Decree case still exists today. They still fight in that case today. Everybody does, over that old decree. And he said, can you tell me why all these devastating things have happened? Why is this happening? It seems like the focus has been on the Apaches. And I put in the chat a letter from 1924 that Carl Hayden had made an inquiry to the Secretary, I think Secretary of War or something. And he asked, what was the total cost to the American people of the Apache Wars? Essentially to come out here and have the Apache Wars to hunt down Geronimo and that kind of thing. And this letter is a response to him. And it was right before the SCIP project got passed. And it's very interesting because I've come across some of those little bits and pieces of historical documents and that kind of thing. But I mean, there's a whole story. It's like, I feel like I want to write an article or a book or something that talks about that, this history from San Carlos's perspective. And I understand, David, you're doing Gila River Indian Community's perspective, but there's just so many different dynamics at play. And I felt like it was important, that we acknowledge that a lot of times more than one tribe's affected and not everybody's affected in positive ways. So I was wondering, David, do you have any discussions in your book about San Carlos Apache and what happened or anything like that? I haven't gotten the chance to read your books.
Robin, great comment and appreciate the comments from your background. There is a little, but as you noted, my focus is looking at the decree and the project from the community's perspective, trying to understand how the project affected and impacted the community. Obviously, you can't look at the Gila Decree without having some involvement of San Carlos Apache, as you've alluded to. They certainly were part of the decree with 6,000 acre feet of water. But no, to answer your question, there's not a lot. I did not look at that component. I mean, that's part of a bigger story. I wanted to focus on what was important for the community.
Oh, I totally understand. But I feel like this story needs to be written too, like as a compendium. And maybe that's going to be my job someday. I don't know. I love history. I love writing, but I'm busy being a lawyer right now, but maybe, in my older years, maybe I can dig around because I love being in the archives, just like you.
Robin, if you write a book, we'll invite you to give a talk on the book here. So consider that an open future invitation. And good to have you here and glad you're here. I think we have time for one more question. Is there one in the room? If not, you've got another one there. Well, we may only have time for one, so why don't we go to your first of the two and we'll see.
Yeah, so we had one from Stephen Kelly asking, David, what are your thoughts on the Central Mesa Reuse Project and how that factors into the community's future plans?
Okay, I missed my thoughts on the Central
Mesa Reuse Project and how it factors into the community's future plans.
But by the Central Mesa Reuse Project, I presume you're talking about the pipeline that's conveying reclaimed water?
I have no idea. I'm reading off of the chat.
So what's the other question? Because maybe we'll just defer that one.
Yes.
Deal with that
Yes.
online.
Okay, well, then I can
is-
answer that. We are tying into that. In fact, we are well ahead of Mesa. They're well over a year behind in conveying that water. That's water under the water settlement. And we very much want that water. The community very much wants that water because that is zero cost water. And it's all used for agricultural purposes. So we have a reclaimed pipeline that will be done in July. We're already pumping water through the first half. We're waiting for Mesa to deliver the water.
Okay, so that was quick. One more,
Yeah,
and then
one
we'll.
more. All right, we have one from Thomas Throssell, saying that you mentioned a future book potentially titled The Gila Restored. I understand that the community has a restored portion of the river at the MAR 5 site. Are there any plans to expand that site or add more areas in the community, and or are there plans not related to that type of restoration? Skipping ahead a little bit. Is the community working with other tribes like the Akimel O'otham to share their respective riparian restoration projects, best practices, and outcomes for their efforts?
Yeah, a lot of pieces to that question. Yes, we have the MAR 5 site. That was our first site where the Gila River Interpretive Trail is. It has been expanded to, I think, as large as it's probably going to get in terms of the physical impact footprint. We are in the process. That site, we deliver 20,000 acre feet of CAP water annually. The permit is being updated as we speak. We're in the final stages. We anticipate by the end of March having the permit. We will then start recharging 40,000 acre feet there. That is restoring, as he alludes to in the question, we are restoring portions of the Gila River. We have pieces of the river that are flowing. As importantly, we're recharging the aquifer. We're protecting the aquifer, and that's a big goal of the community. That we don't want to pump more groundwater than what nature or managed aquifer recharge provides. So the recharge sites are critically important to the overall management of the water within the community. But there are 3 other sites. The third one will go online. Again, we hope by end of March, early April, and you'll see it. It's right adjacent to Interstate 10. When you cross the Gila River Bridge, look on the west side. That's our 4th site that will come online later this year, this spring.
Great. We have several thank yous and good presentation sort of comments.
Well, thank you for those that are online, and thank you for all of you that are in person. I appreciate your time.
And thank you. Anybody wants to get, he does need to get back